Sir, I believe there's been a mistake.
Or there will be serious
First class isn't
consequences.
for everyone. Captain Thomas Wilson's voice sliced through the ambient hum of the aircraft cabin, sharp and dismissive. Every word dripped with condescension as his eyes narrowed at the passenger seated in 3A, a well-built black man in dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt. Wilson's posture stiffened, chin lifting slightly, a physical manifestation of judgment before a word of response had been spoken. The cabin froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman in the second row audibly gasped, then quickly pretended to cough. The flight attendant paused with a champagne bottle suspended in air, her professional smile faltering as she registered the captain's tone. Elijah Montgomery didn't flinch. His eyes calculating, observant, locked with Wilson's for 3 uncomfortable seconds before he responded, voice calm but resonant with unmistakable authority. "This seat is exactly where I belong." The statement hung in the air, not defensive, not aggressive, just certain. Something in his quiet confidence made a businessman across the aisle shift uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated with his phone screen. No one yet understood that this brief exchange, these few charged seconds at Gate B-17 of JFK International, would completely transform an entire airline before the day was through. The pilot standing in the aisle, gold stripes gleaming on his sleeves, had just made a catastrophic error that would end his 25-year career. He had challenged the man who owned not just the seat, but the plane, the route, and the entire airline. And in exactly 30 minutes, that revelation would change everything. Elijah Montgomery had built Horizon Airways from nothing into an industry disruptor in just 9 years, all while maintaining a deliberately low profile. At 38, he had the financial resources to travel however he pleased, but he chose to fly his airline quarterly as an anonymous passenger, experiencing the service exactly as his customers did, without the artificial deference that comes with recognition. Today he'd dressed with calculated casualness, premium dark jeans that fit perfectly, a high-quality blue button-down with barely visible stitching, and Italian leather shoes that spoke of taste rather than flash. His watch, a Patek Philippe, worth more than some cars, was his only concession to his actual net worth, and even that was understated enough that only the truly observant would recognize its significance. Behind his measured calm lay a brilliant strategic mind that had revolutionized the airline industry. After selling his passenger experience technology company at 29, he'd been appalled by how major carriers treated their customers. Airlines have forgotten they're in the people business, not just the transportation business. He'd told his initial investors before acquiring a struggling regional carrier and transforming it into Horizon Airways, now famous for exceptional service regardless of ticket class. The company's success wasn't just financial. It had created an entire philosophy around dignity in air travel. Until today, that philosophy had never been so directly challenged, especially not with the founder himself as the target. Captain Thomas Wilson embodied everything Elijah had worked to change in aviation culture. At 52, Wilson carried himself with the rigid authority of a man who believed his uniform automatically commanded respect. His thinning silver hair was meticulously groomed, his posture military straight, his expression perpetually set in slight disapproval, as though the world consistently failed to meet his exacting standards. Wilson had joined Horizon 5 years earlier when his previous airline folded, bringing with him impeccable safety credentials and 22,000 flight hours of experience. What his record didn't show was his growing resentment toward what he called the new airline culture, one that emphasized passenger experience over traditional hierarchies and pilot authority. Behind closed doors, he complained about sensitivity trainings and customer coddling, seeing them as distractions from the real business of aviation. He'd passed Horizon's required courses with minimal engagement, viewing them as necessary evils rather than valuable development. Today, that perfunctory compliance would be exposed as dangerously inadequate. First Officer Daniela Rodriguez, 34, sat in the cockpit completing pre-flight checks, unaware of the confrontation unfolding in the cabin. The daughter of Mexican immigrants, she'd worked her way through flight school, waitressing nights and weekends, earning her wings through pure determination and exceptional skill. Rodriguez had joined Horizon specifically because of its progressive reputation. With sharp intelligence reflected in her quick, observant eyes and direct manner, she had navigated the often challenging dynamic with Wilson by focusing on professional competence rather than engaging with his occasional outdated comments. She'd learned to pick her battles carefully, filing confidential reports about his behavior while maintaining workable cockpit relationships. Today would test those careful boundaries in ways she couldn't imagine. Head flight attendant Sofia Martinez managed the cabin with the practiced precision of an 18-year veteran who had seen aviation at its best and worst. At 42, she carried herself with the polished confidence of someone who knew exactly how to handle difficult situations without creating additional drama. Horizon had recruited her from a budget carrier 2 years ago, doubling her salary and introducing her to a culture that valued cabin crew as professionals rather than sky waitresses. Her alertness had already registered Wilson's confrontational posture the moment he entered the cabin, and she was moving to intervene when he addressed Elijah. Her position had taught her the delicate dance between supporting crew authority and protecting passenger dignity, a balance about to be severely tested. Among the first-class passengers, Laura Thompson stood out with her athlete's build and power suit that radiated executive presence. At 45, the investment banker had built her career by recognizing significant moments before others did, a talent that immediately activated when Wilson's voice cut through the cabin. Unlike passengers who suddenly became fascinated with their reading materials, Laura observed with laser focus, subtly positioning her phone on her lap as the scene unfolded. Something in her expression suggested she'd witnessed similar interactions before and had decided this one wouldn't pass undocumented. Michael Taylor, a 29-year-old flight attendant still in his probationary period, froze by the galley, blonde and eager to please. His eyes darted between Wilson and Sophia, clearly conflicted between supporting a senior crew member and recognizing the wrongness unfolding before him. His hands tightened around the champagne bottle he was preparing to serve, knuckles whitening slightly as he battled his instinct to disappear into the galley versus standing witness to whatever happened next. As these individuals converged in the premium cabin of Flight 1127, none fully understood how the next 30 minutes would permanently alter their professional trajectories, challenging assumptions about authority belonging and the consequences of unchecked bias in positions of power. Horizon Airways Flight 1127 represented everything Elijah Montgomery had envisioned when founding his airline, a perfect blend of luxury technology and genuine hospitality that never sacrificed human dignity for operational efficiency. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner had been customized to his exacting specifications, with the first-class cabin reimagined as a space where elegance served comfort rather than status. The cabin featured ambient lighting that subtly adjusted to passengers' circadian rhythms, hand-stitched leather seats calibrated to provide perfect support, and acoustic engineering that created islands of tranquility in the shared space. Elijah had personally spent months with designers ensuring every detail enhanced the passenger experience without creating unnecessary barriers between service classes. Outside the aircraft windows, JFK International Airport's Terminal 5 pulsed with its particular rhythm of controlled chaos. October sunlight streamed through massive windows, illuminating the constant motion of travelers, crew, and airport staff navigating their intersecting journeys. Ground crews in high-visibility vests moved with practiced efficiency, their choreographed dance of luggage carts and fuel hoses forming the invisible infrastructure of air travel. Inside the terminal, the distinct populations of aviation moved in their separate streams, families corralling children and carry-ons. Solo business travelers gliding through with minimalist efficiency, airline staff marching purposefully against the flow. Announcements echoed through the vast spaces, creating the distinctive audio landscape that seasoned travelers had learned to filter selectively for relevant information. The boarding process for Flight 1127 had proceeded with Horizon's signature orderliness. Gate staff in the company's distinctive charcoal gray uniforms with sunset orange accents had welcomed passengers by name, managing the flow with personalized attention that distinguished Horizon from carriers that treated boarding as a cattle call rather than the beginning of the service experience. What truly set Horizon apart wasn't just its attention to aesthetics or technology, but its remarkable consistency. While most airlines performed well during inspection visits and faltered during regular operations, Horizon maintained exceptional standards across its fleet. Industry analysts attributed this to higher pay scales and innovative training, but insiders knew it stemmed from something less quantifiable, a genuine mission that employees actually believed in rather than merely complied with. Founded just 9 years earlier, Horizon had expanded from 3 planes to 67 aircraft serving 4 continents, making headlines for transforming failing airlines into customer satisfaction leaders. Yet its most distinctive feature remained the mysterious founder who rarely appeared in public and never gave interviews. Aviation blogs constantly speculated about Elijah Montgomery, creating mythologies ranging from eccentric recluse to figurehead for shadowy investors. The truth that he regularly flew his own airline as an anonymous passenger would have shocked even his senior executives, only 3 of whom knew about his quarterly quality check flights. As Flight 1127 prepared for departure to San Francisco, the aviation industry context added subtle pressure to the developing situation. Pilot shortages, rising fuel costs, and the eternal tension between shareholder demands and customer expectations created an operating environment where carriers constantly balanced competing priorities. Horizon had navigated these challenges more successfully than most, but maintaining that success required constant vigilance and adaptation. Inside the first-class cabin where Elijah now sat calmly meeting Captain Wilson's challenging gaze, these broader industry concerns condensed into a single moment of tension, a collision between aviation's hierarchical past and Horizon's vision of its more equitable future. The sophisticated air filtration system might remove the smallest particles, but it couldn't disperse the thickening atmosphere of confrontation building with each passing second. The path that led Elijah Montgomery to airline ownership began in Baltimore, where his educator parents had emphasized that excellence was the only effective response to lowered expectations. His father, a high school principal known for transforming failing schools, and his mother, a community college professor who helped first-generation students navigate higher education, had sacrificed to send him to a private school where he'd often been one of few black students in his class. Those formative years taught him something crucial about navigating spaces not designed with him in mind: observation before action. He developed an almost anthropological approach to understanding unwritten rules and expectations, a skill that served him well at MIT and later in Silicon Valley, where he founded Transit Tech, revolutionary passenger experience software that transformed how people navigated airports and planned travel. After selling Transit Tech for $340 million, he'd planned early retirement until a disastrous first-class flight, where he'd been repeatedly mistaken for a staff member, despite his premium ticket culminating in a flight attendant asking him to assist an elderly passenger with luggage while actual crew members stood nearby. "If this is how they treat first-class passengers who look like me," he'd told his financial advisor afterward, "imagine the experience in economy." That realization sparked his seemingly impulsive purchase of a struggling regional airline dismissed by industry experts as a wealthy man's vanity project. 9 years later, no one was questioning his vision. Building Horizon Airways meant overcoming entrenched skepticism. Veterans insisted passengers cared only about price and punctuality, not experiential details. Investors questioned whether treating employees substantially better would improve bottom-line results. Government regulators seemed determined to maintain status quo operations despite innovation opportunities. Elijah had persisted by creating his anonymous founder persona, allowing authentic experience of his airline while gathering unfiltered feedback. These quarterly quality checks had become almost sacred to him, a practice that kept him connected to reality rather than quarterly reports and executive summaries that inevitably sanitized problems. Thomas Wilson had joined Horizon during the acquisition of Skystream Airlines, where he'd been a senior captain. His initial interviews had raised red flags. He'd questioned Horizon's passenger-first philosophy and suggested modern airlines suffered from too much coddling of customers and not enough respect for operational authority. Despite these concerns, his technical qualifications were impeccable, and Horizon's rapid expansion created urgent need for experienced captains. Wilson had been hired with the understanding he would adapt to company culture, a transition aided by substantial salary increase and premium route assignments. For 4 years, Wilson had performed adequately, though his personnel file contained several notes about cultural alignment opportunities. He'd completed required training, including Horizon's unique Service Beyond Altitude program, but colleagues noted his tendency to view such initiatives as necessary hoops rather than meaningful practices. His relationship with First Officer Rodriguez had been professionally correct, but personally strained from the beginning. He'd initially made comments about adjusted standards, enabling her promotion, which she'd addressed directly in a private conversation that left him defensive but more careful around her. Since then, they'd established a working relationship based on professional respect, though she remained vigilant about his boundary-crossing remarks. Sofia Martinez had encountered Wilson on previous flights and developed strategies for managing his traditional expectations of cabin crew. She understood the complex dynamics between cockpit and cabin, the historical hierarchies that placed pilots, particularly captains, at the top of the airline authority structure. Her experience had taught her when to defer, when to redirect, and when to firmly establish boundaries. Throughout Horizon, employees shared a fundamental understanding that the airline operated differently than legacy carriers. From ground staff to mechanics, from gate agents to pilots, the company cultivated an environment where every role contributed to the passenger experience. This philosophy had created unusually high employee retention rates and industry-leading customer satisfaction scores. What no one on Flight 1127 yet realized was how this carefully constructed culture was about to be tested not through corporate initiative or industry disruption, but through a simple interaction between a pilot who valued position above purpose and a founder whose anonymity was about to be dramatically compromised. Have you ever been judged before someone knew your true worth? That moment when someone looks at you and makes assumptions based on appearance, only to later discover just how wrong they were. The story you're about to witness captures exactly that experience. A powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving and respect should never be conditional. Before we continue, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I'd love to see how far this story is reaching. And if you believe everyone deserves equal respect, regardless of appearance, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to stories that challenge our assumptions and inspire positive change. In just 30 minutes, everything on this flight is about to change. A confrontation that begins with bias will transform into a powerful lesson about leadership, dignity, and consequences. You won't want to miss what happens next. Now back to our story aboard Horizon Airways Flight 1127, where Captain Wilson is about to discover the true identity of the passenger he's confronting. Perhaps you misunderstood the boarding process. Wilson continued, his voice lowering but intensifying as he leaned slightly forward. First class is reserved for our premium passengers who typically, he paused, eyes flicking deliberately over Elijah's clothing, meet certain expectations. The cabin temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. A woman in 4B suddenly became intensely interested in her magazine flipping pages without reading a word. The businessman in 2C glanced over, then away, then back again, his expression caught between discomfort and morbid fascination. Elijah remained perfectly still, only his eyes moving as they assessed Wilson with surgical precision. Years of high-stakes negotiations had taught him to recognize defining moments interactions where responses determined entire trajectories. This was undeniably such a moment. "Captain," he replied, voice even, but carrying effortlessly throughout the quiet cabin. "I understand your concern for maintaining standards. My boarding pass was scanned, verified by your ground staff, and confirmed by your flight attendant. I'm exactly where I belong." Something in the calm certainty of this response, the complete absence of defensiveness or agitation, seemed to irritate Wilson more than outright defiance would have. His jaw tightened visibly, a muscle pulsing at his temple. "Sir, our first-class experience comes with certain protocols." Head Flight Attendant Sophia Martinez approached with professional grace, positioning herself slightly between Wilson and Elijah, creating a buffer without overtly challenging the captain's authority. "Is everything all right here, Captain?" she asked, her trained smile not quite reaching her eyes, which communicated clear concern about the situation unfolding. "Ms. Martinez," Wilson responded without taking his gaze from Elijah, "could you please verify this passenger's documentation? There seems to be confusion about seating assignment." The implication hung in the air, unmistakable to everyone within earshot. This wasn't about documentation. It was about who looked right in first class. The silent judgment was louder than any announcement. Sophia's professionalism didn't waver, though something flashed briefly behind her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of what was actually occurring beneath the veneer of procedure. "Of course, Captain." She turned to Elijah. "Sir, may I please see your boarding pass?" Elijah retrieved his phone and displayed the digital pass. "Certainly." Sophia glanced at it and nodded, her posture subtly shifting toward Elijah in silent solidarity. "Everything appears to be in order. Mr. Montgomery is confirmed for seat 3A. Wilson's nostrils flared slightly. There must be a system error. Perhaps an upgrade that wasn't properly processed. From across the aisle, Laura Thompson lowered her phone to her lap screen, facing upward, the red recording light clearly visible. Her eyes met Elijah's briefly, a silent acknowledgement that what was happening wasn't acceptable and wouldn't go undocumented. Flight attendant Michael Taylor approached with a beverage tray, then froze as he assessed the tension. His eyes darted between Wilson and Sophia, seeking guidance on whether to proceed with service or retreat until the situation resolved. In the cockpit doorway, First Officer Rodriguez appeared initially, coming to inform Wilson about a minor flight plan adjustment. She paused as she registered the confrontation, immediately understanding its nature from Wilson's stance and the uncomfortable expressions of nearby passengers. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely, the usual pre-departure anticipation replaced by a crackling tension that demanded resolution. Flight 127's scheduled departure time was 12 minutes away, with boarding nearly complete and the aircraft door about to close. Elijah's next decision would determine whether this became a brief, uncomfortable exchange quickly forgotten, or something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of everyone present. As he weighed options, his outward composure never wavered, the same calm, measured presence that had guided Horizon Airways from concept to industry leader. What no one yet realized was that the real turbulence would begin long before Flight 1127 left the ground. Captain Wilson shifted strategies, adopting a patronizing tone that somehow contained more condescension than his previous approach. "Mr. Montgomery," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "I'm simply ensuring all passengers receive the experience they've paid for. First class requires proper verification, especially given recent incidents." Elijah's eyebrow raised a fraction of an inch. "What incidents would those be, Captain?" The question hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Simple words that forced Wilson to either retreat or reveal more of his underlying assumptions. Wilson's neck reddened above his crisp white collar. We've had situations where passengers attempt to access accommodations they haven't purchased. His careful phrasing couldn't disguise the ugliness beneath. It's my responsibility to maintain standards. Standards. Elijah repeated the single word, somehow transforming into a penetrating question. Sophia intervened with diplomatic precision. Captain, I've verified Mr. Montgomery's reservation. We're scheduled to push back in 11 minutes. Wilson didn't acknowledge her, fixing Elijah with an increasingly hostile stare. I need to see your ID, sir, for verification purposes. The request crossed a professional line so clearly that a passenger in the second row audibly muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." ID verification wasn't standard procedure for already seated passengers with confirmed boarding passes. Several nearby passengers exchanged glances, the collective discomfort rising perceptibly. Is this a request you're making of all first-class passengers today? Elijah asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than defensive. The question was devastating in its simplicity, highlighting the discriminatory nature of the request, without directly accusing Wilson of bias. It was the verbal equivalent of a perfect chess move, leaving Wilson with no good options. Wilson's face darkened. I'm making this request of you, sir, as the captain of this aircraft. From the cockpit doorway, First Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. Captain, we've received the updated weather briefing. We should review it before departure. Her intervention was a transparent attempt to extract Wilson from the escalating situation. This will just take a moment, Rodriguez. Wilson dismissed her without taking his eyes off Elijah, the dismissal communicating volumes about his professional relationships. Laura Thompson had abandoned any pretense of disinterest. Her phone was now held at an angle that clearly indicated recording. Nearby, an elderly gentleman with distinguished silver hair and tortoiseshell glasses frowned deeply, his disapproval evident as he watched Wilson's behavior with growing disgust. Michael Taylor, still holding his tray of pre-departure beverages, caught Sophia's eye with a silent question. She gave a subtle nod, and he cautiously approached Elijah. Would you care for champagne or orange juice before takeoff, sir? He asked, his voice slightly higher than normal due to the tension. Orange juice would be fine, thank you. Elijah replied with a genuine smile that acknowledged the young flight attendant's difficult position. This ordinary service interaction seemed to further irritate Wilson, as though normal hospitality extended to Elijah undermined his authority. We're discussing a security matter. Wilson snapped at Michael, who nearly spilled the juice he was pouring. With respect, Captain, Sophia interjected, her professional tone now edged with steel. There doesn't appear to be a security concern here. Mr. Montgomery has a confirmed reservation and has been properly boarded. Ms. Martinez, Wilson replied, his voice hardening. Cockpit crew are responsible for final security determinations. If I have concerns, they need to be addressed before departure. The invocation of security protocols designed for genuine threats to resolve what was clearly bias created a dangerous escalation. Once such protocols were formally initiated, they could trigger response mechanisms throughout the airport. Rodriguez, recognizing the potential consequences, took a more direct approach. Captain Wilson, she said with unexpected firmness. May I speak with you privately? There's an operational matter requiring your immediate attention. Her tone finally broke through. Wilson hesitated, then nodded curtly. We'll continue this momentarily, he said to Elijah before following Rodriguez toward the cockpit. As they stepped away, the cabin seemed to collectively exhale. Sophia leaned closer to Elijah. I apologize for this situation, Mr. Montgomery. I assure you this isn't representative of Horizon's standards. I understand completely, Elijah replied, his gaze following Wilson's retreating form with analytical interest rather than anger. Laura Thompson leaned across the aisle. That was completely inappropriate, she said in a low voice. I recorded most of it. If you need a witness statement, I'm happy to provide one. I appreciate your concern, Elijah replied, genuinely touched by the unexpected allyship. Near the galley, Michael whispered urgently to another flight attendant. Did you see that Wilson was practically demanding his papers? In first class, the ripple effects spread throughout the cabin. Some passengers pretended nothing had happened, burying themselves in magazines or screens. Others exchanged knowing glances or whispered comments. A few watched the cockpit door, wondering what was transpiring behind it. In the brief reprieve, Elijah considered his options. He could identify himself now, immediately resolving the situation but creating different disruption. He could comply with Wilson's inappropriate demands, maintaining his cover, but reinforcing problematic behavior. Or he could stand firm on principle, seeing how the situation would resolve through normal channels. His decision was interrupted by Wilson's reemergence from the cockpit. The captain's expression was now professionally neutral, but with a hardness around the eyes, suggesting the conversation with Rodriguez hadn't gone in his favor. Ms. Martinez, please ensure all pre-departure procedures are completed on schedule. We'll be pushing back in 7 minutes. With that brief instruction, noticeably avoiding any reference to the previous confrontation, Wilson returned to the cockpit. The immediate crisis appeared to have passed, but the tension lingering in the cabin suggested it was merely paused rather than resolved. What no one could see was Wilson in the cockpit reaching for the internal phone to call the gate agent. His voice low and controlled, he requested information about a potential seating verification issue with the passenger in 3A. The confrontation hadn't ended, it had simply changed venues. As the cabin settled into uneasy pre-departure routine, Elijah maintained his outward composure while a storm gathered beneath the surface. 20 years of navigating racism in elite spaces had taught him to separate emotional reactions from strategic responses, a survival skill now serving a different purpose. Behind his calm expression, anger flickered, not the hot, reactive kind that drove impulsive responses, but a cold-focused fury at seeing the same patterns repeat in the airline he'd built specifically to counteract them. The irony wasn't lost on him being profiled on his own aircraft in the premium cabin he'd personally designed for equal comfort regardless of appearance. Part of him wanted to stand up right now, reveal his identity, and watch Wilson's face as realization dawned. The fantasy played vividly in his mind, the immediate shift in the captain's demeanor, the shocked expressions of other passengers, the swift consequences that would follow. The purely human satisfaction of that moment was undeniably tempting. Yet the strategic leader in him recognized a rare opportunity to witness how his company handled discrimination when they didn't know the owner was watching. Would Horizon's values hold without his direct intervention? Would the systems he'd built function as designed? The answers to those questions held more long-term value than the momentary vindication of immediate revelation. Still, the personal sting remained. Memories surfaced unbidden, being followed by store security at 16 while shopping for his mother's birthday gift. The college advisor, who had suggested he consider more realistic majors than computer science. The venture capitalist who had addressed questions about Transit Tech's business model to Elijah's white deputy rather than to him directly. Each incident had shaped his leadership philosophy. When founding Horizon, he'd been adamant. We're not just building an airline, we're creating an environment where everyone belongs. Had he failed? Or was Wilson simply an outlier, a holdover from aviation's more hierarchical past, who had somehow slipped through Horizon's cultural alignment process? The bigger question was what to do now. Remaining silent carried costs beyond his personal discomfort. Every minute this situation continued sent a message to everyone watching that such behavior might be tolerated. The impact extended beyond him to every passenger witnessing it, particularly those who had experienced similar treatment elsewhere. Elijah's hands rested on his armrests, outwardly relaxed, but fingers pressing slightly harder than necessary into the leather. The tension between personal dignity and leadership responsibility created an internal pressure that required conscious management, the same balance he'd navigated throughout his career, just with more immediate stakes. Across the cabin, Captain Wilson was conducting his own internal dialogue as he mechanically reviewed flight plans. The confrontation had not gone as expected. In his 25 years of flying, he'd developed what he considered a sixth sense about passengers who belonged where, who might cause problems, who deserved extra attention. He genuinely believed he was protecting the airline's premium experience. First class represented a standard, and maintaining that standard was part of his responsibility as captain. If passengers didn't match the expected profile, wasn't it reasonable to verify their status? Rodriguez's reaction in the cockpit had unsettled him. "This isn't about security, and you know it," she'd said with unexpected directness. "This is about assumptions based on appearance, and it needs to stop now before you create a situation we can't fix." Her forthright challenge had caught him off guard. Junior officers typically didn't confront captains so directly. Was she right? Wilson pushed the question away, focusing instead on his authority. As captain, final decisions were his responsibility. The growing emphasis on passenger experience over traditional aviation hierarchies felt like dilution of standards that had served the industry for decades. Still, a nagging discomfort persisted. The passenger had been perfectly calm, his documentation apparently in order. What exactly was Wilson objecting to beyond the man's failure to match his mental image of a first-class passenger? This line of questioning felt dangerous, threatening to undermine certainties that had guided his entire career. Better to focus on operational matters, weather patterns, fuel calculations, departure procedures. These at least offered the comfort of clear right and wrong answers. In the main cabin, Sofia Martinez efficiently directed pre-departure service while processing her own complex reactions. Her 18 years in aviation had taught her to navigate difficult situations with diplomacy. But this confrontation had crossed into territory that diplomacy alone couldn't resolve. She felt torn between professional obligations. As lead flight attendant, she was responsible for supporting the captain's authority. But she was equally responsible for ensuring passengers were treated with dignity and respect, a core element of Horizon's training that had drawn her to the airline. Wilson's behavior clearly violated company standards, yet confronting a captain directly carried significant professional risk. Airline hierarchies were deeply entrenched, and even Horizon's more progressive culture hadn't completely eliminated the traditional power dynamics between cockpit and cabin crew. She'd already decided to file a report after landing, but was that enough? Should she have been more direct in the moment? The questions circled without clear resolution as she mechanically verified cabin readiness for departure. First Officer Rodriguez sat in the cockpit running through pre-flight checklists with meticulous attention while processing her own discomfort. Her direct confrontation with Wilson had been professionally risky but ethically necessary. "You're making assumptions based on how he looks," she had told him plainly once they were alone in the cockpit. "That violates everything Horizon stands for, and you know it." Wilson's dismissive response, "You're overreacting to standard security procedures," had only strengthened her resolve. She knew those weren't standard procedures. In 6 years of flying, she'd never seen a captain question a properly boarded first-class passenger about their right to be there. Now she faced difficult calculations about next steps. If Wilson escalated the situation further, what would she do? At what point did professional loyalty to a fellow pilot become complicity in discrimination? She had worked too hard to build her career to risk it impulsively, but some lines couldn't be crossed, regardless of consequences. Throughout the cabin, similar internal negotiations were occurring among witnesses. Laura Thompson was considering whether to send her recording to Horizon customer service immediately or wait until after landing. Michael Taylor was wondering if his probationary status required silence or if his ethical obligations outweighed career concerns. Even passengers uninvolved in the initial confrontation were processing what they'd observed, measuring their own comfort with silent witness. As boarding completed and the cabin door prepared to close, these internal struggles remained unresolved questions of responsibility, authority, values, and actions circling without clear answers. But events were about to force everyone's hand, transforming private ethical calculations into public declarations of principle. As Flight 1127's departure time approached, ripples of secondary tension spread throughout the aircraft. What had begun as a single confrontation between Wilson and Elijah expanded into interconnected conflicts that touched nearly everyone aboard. Near the back of first class, two passengers who had witnessed the incident engaged in an increasingly heated exchange. "The captain was just doing his job," insisted a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, voice low but defensive. "Security procedures exist for a reason." "Would he have questioned a white businessman in a suit?" countered the woman beside him, an academic in her 60s with steel-gray hair and piercing eyes. "We both know the answer." Their debate, though hushed, carried to nearby seats, drawing others into whispered conversations about what they'd witnessed. The cabin divided into loose factions, those who viewed Wilson's actions as justified security measures and those who recognized the discriminatory undertones. Laura Thompson found herself in an unexpected confrontation when the businessman seated beside her noticed her recording and leaned over with obvious disapproval. "You shouldn't be filming. It's an invasion of privacy and could compromise aircraft security," he hissed. Laura met his gaze directly, unintimidated. "Documenting potential discrimination isn't a security threat. It's accountability. You people always see discrimination where there's just standard procedure," he muttered loud enough for her to hear. Laura's eyes flashed. "What exactly do you mean by you people?" The man flushed and turned away, suddenly fascinated with the safety card in his seat pocket. At the aircraft door, a new complication emerged. The scheduled departure time had arrived, but ground operations reported a delay due to final passenger verification, bureaucratic language that suggested Wilson's call to the gate agent had triggered additional review. This delay created ripple effects beyond the ethical questions at hand. Passengers connecting to international flights checked watches nervously. A mother with a young child worried aloud about their tight layover in San Francisco. Business travelers sighed dramatically at the prospect of missed meetings. Sophia approached Elijah with carefully neutral expression. "Mr. Montgomery, I apologize for the delay. It appears there's some additional verification occurring. Can I bring you another beverage while we wait?" Elijah understood the subtext. Immediately, Wilson had escalated the situation beyond the cabin. "I'm fine, thank you. How long do these verifications typically take?" "They're not typical at all, sir." Her emphasis conveyed volumes, especially not for confirmed passengers already aboard. From the front galley, Michael observed their exchange while restocking the beverage cart. Another flight attendant, a veteran named James, shook his head in disgust. "Wilson's gone too far this time," James muttered. "This isn't about security, it's about power." "What should we do?" Michael asked, genuine uncertainty in his question. James sighed. "Document everything, and be ready to make statements later." Their conversation was interrupted as First Officer Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit, her expression professionally neutral, but her movements betraying tension. She approached Sophia and spoke in a low voice that nonetheless carried to nearby seats. "The captain has requested verification of passenger manifests due to a security concern. Ground operations is asking for clarification since there's no standard protocol for re-verifying already boarded passengers." The technical language didn't disguise the underlying reality. Wilson was creating procedural barriers because his initial direct approach had failed. As this conversation occurred, the cabin door reopened, and a ground agent stepped aboard with a tablet in hand. Her confused expression suggested she didn't fully understand her assignment. She conferred briefly with Sophia, occasionally glancing toward Elijah's seat with obvious uncertainty. The delay had now reached 15 minutes past scheduled departure. The ambient tension in the cabin intensified as passengers began to show visible signs of frustration, checking watches, sighing audibly, tapping armrests. What had begun as an isolated confrontation was now affecting everyone aboard. In this atmosphere of mounting pressure, new conflicts emerged. A passenger, irritated by the delay, loudly complained to Michael, "What's the holdup? We should have pushed back already." When Michael offered only a vague explanation about procedural verifications, the passenger grew more agitated, demanding specifics. Meanwhile, Laura found herself drawn into a whispered conversation with the elderly academic woman who introduced herself as Dr. Eleanor Winters, Professor Emeritus of Sociology. "You recorded what happened?" the professor asked. When Laura nodded, the professor continued, "Good. These moments need documentation. Too often they're dismissed as misunderstandings." Their conversation was interrupted by the businessman who had previously objected to Laura's recording. "You're both overreacting. The captain was just being thorough." "Selective thoroughness has a long and troubling history, sir." Dr. Winters replied, her tone mild, but her words precise as surgical instruments. Near the cockpit, Rodriguez and the ground agent engaged in a tense discussion. The agent's perplexed expression suggested Wilson's request didn't align with any standard procedure she recognized. Rodriguez's controlled frustration was evident in her rigid posture and clipped gestures. Throughout the cabin, what had begun as a single confrontation had metastasized into multiple points of tension. Passenger against passenger, crew against protocol schedule against delay. The atmosphere had transformed from the usual pre-departure anticipation to something more complicated and volatile. Elijah observed these developments with growing concern. He'd intended to evaluate service standards, not create an operational disruption. Yet Wilson's response to his presence had triggered exactly that. The question was no longer whether to reveal his identity, but when and how to do so with minimum impact on the other passengers whose travel was now being affected. As the delay stretched to 20 minutes, the secondary conflicts throughout the aircraft made one thing clear. What had begun as discrimination against one passenger had evolved into a situation affecting everyone aboard Flight 127. The incident was no longer isolated. It had become collective. As the standoff continued, each person's true character emerged not through words, but actions, small choices with significant implications that revealed who they really were under pressure. Elijah, still seated calmly in 3A, retrieved his phone and typed a brief message. His movements unhurried, despite the growing tension around him. When Sophia passed by, he asked a question that surprised her. "Ms. Martinez, how long have you been with Horizon?" 2 years next month, she replied, momentarily thrown by this shift to personal conversation amid the escalating situation. "And what drew you to the company?" The question might have seemed like small talk, but his genuine interest and focus on her amid his own difficult situation revealed something essential about his character. His instinct, even when under attack, was to connect with others and understand their experiences. "The culture, actually," Sophia answered with unexpected candor. After 15 years at carriers where cabin crew were treated as disposable, Horizon's approach was revolutionary. Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "That culture is built by people like you, not policies on paper." This simple exchange, investing in human connection during conflict rather than withdrawing into self-protection, demonstrated why Elijah had succeeded in building an airline known for exceptional service. He led by example, even when no one knew he was leading. Meanwhile, Captain Wilson's character was similarly revealed through telling actions. When the ground agent reported that she found no irregularities in the passenger manifest, his response was immediately revealing. "Check for recent upgrades or standby assignments," he insisted, his tone suggesting the agent had missed something obvious. When she explained that the system showed no anomalies, he cut her off. Just bring me the complete manifest. I'll review it myself. This reflexive distrust of others' competence, combined with absolute faith in his own judgment, exposed a fundamental aspect of Wilson's character: his conviction that his perceptions superseded objective evidence, particularly when that evidence contradicted his assumptions. When the agent hesitated, Wilson added, "This is a security matter under Captain's authority, invoking a serious protocol designed for genuine threats." This willingness to misuse security procedures to support personal bias revealed something darker: how authority without accountability could corrupt even established professionals. First Officer Rodriguez revealed her character through more subtle actions. Rather than directly contradicting her captain, an approach that would likely escalate tension, she methodically documented each deviation from standard procedure in the flight log. Her entries were precise, factual, and comprehensive, creating an objective record that would speak for itself. When Wilson noticed her detailed documentation, his eyes narrowed. That level of detail isn't necessary for routine delays. I consider proper documentation essential to safety protocols, Captain, she replied evenly, continuing to write, especially when standard procedures are modified. Her approach, working within the system while ensuring accountability, demonstrated both strategic thinking and moral courage. She found a way to uphold principles without creating additional conflict, revealing the thoughtful leadership qualities that had advanced her career despite industry barriers. Sofia Martinez's character emerged through her distribution of attention during the delay. While maintaining professional courtesy with all passengers, she made a point of checking in with Elijah more frequently than protocol required, not with additional services, but with simple human acknowledgement. "Is there anything else you need, Mr. Montgomery?" she asked during one such check-in. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied with a genuine smile that acknowledged her support. This seemingly routine exchange was actually a quiet act of alignment, a subtle but clear signal that she recognized the injustice occurring and wouldn't pretend otherwise. Her ability to communicate solidarity while maintaining professional standards demonstrated the emotional intelligence that had made her an effective leader. Flight attendant Michael Taylor's character development was perhaps the most dramatic. When he overheard a passenger making a dismissive comment about playing the race card, Michael's internal conflict played visibly across his face: fear for his probationary job status, battling with his sense of right and wrong. After visible hesitation, he approached the passenger with a water bottle. "Sir, I noticed your voice is carrying through the cabin. Some hydration might help with that." The comment was delivered with such pleasant professionalism that it took the passenger a moment to recognize the subtle redirection. This small intervention, finding a way to address problematic behavior without creating confrontation, showed Michael discovering his professional voice. The nervous new hire was evolving into someone who could uphold values while navigating complex social dynamics. Laura Thompson's character revealed itself through consistent follow-through. Having begun recording the initial confrontation, she continued documenting key developments, creating a comprehensive record rather than a selective narrative. When another passenger questioned her actions, she replied simply, "I believe in accountability." Her persistence without grandstanding, capturing events without making herself the center of attention, demonstrated a commitment to justice rather than personal recognition. This steady, purposeful approach reflected the same qualities that had likely contributed to her professional success. Throughout the cabin, even minor characters revealed themselves through small decisions. The academic who offered context and perspective to fellow passengers. The businessman who initially defended Wilson but grew increasingly uncomfortable as the delay continued. The ground agent whose confusion transformed into concern as she recognized the situation's irregular nature. As the delay approached 30 minutes, the collective impact of these character revelations created a shifting dynamic throughout the aircraft. What had begun as isolated individual responses was evolving into something more powerful, a community, finding its collective moral compass through the accumulation of individual choices. The true test of character still awaited as the situation approached its inevitable climax, the moment when private principles would require public declaration, and when the consequences of those declarations would reshape careers and lives. 32 minutes past scheduled departure. Flight 1127 remained at the gate engines silent as tension built toward an unavoidable breaking point. The delay had progressed beyond inconvenience into something passengers recognized as unusual, creating an atmosphere of collective unease throughout the cabin. Elijah's phone vibrated with an incoming text. The message was brief but significant. Verification complete at executive level. Intervention protocol activated. Your call on timing. He read it twice, fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around the device. The decision he'd been weighing was now imminent. Allow the situation to resolve through standard channels or take direct action himself. Either choice would have lasting consequences for everyone involved, particularly Captain Wilson. At the same moment, ground operations contacted the cockpit with increasing concern about the delay. "Captain, we need an explanation for the continued hold. This is affecting our entire departure schedule." Wilson's response revealed his growing isolation. "I'm exercising captain's authority regarding a security verification. We'll depart when I'm satisfied all protocols have been followed." His voice carried a brittle edge, the sound of someone who knew he'd gone too far but couldn't find a way back. First Officer Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful glance with Sophia, who had entered the cockpit to update the crew about cabin status. Their silent communication acknowledged what was becoming increasingly clear: Wilson had crossed from professional caution into something more problematic. "Captain," Rodriguez said carefully, "I've reviewed all documentation. Every passenger is properly manifested with valid boarding verification. There are no security flags in the system." Wilson's jaw tightened visibly. "That's your assessment?" "It's also the assessment of ground operations gate staff and cabin crew," she replied, her tone respectful but firm. The exchange captured the essential tension that had been building throughout the delay, Wilson's increasingly isolated perspective against the combined judgment of every other aviation professional involved. In the main cabin, passengers had begun openly discussing the situation, speculation spreading as the unusual delay continued without explanation. The initial divisions between those who supported Wilson's security concerns and those who recognized discrimination were shifting, with more passengers questioning the legitimacy of the continued hold. Laura Thompson, who had been documenting key developments, leaned across the aisle toward Elijah. "This has gone far beyond reasonable procedure," she said quietly. "I've sent messages to Horizon customer service through their app, but they'll likely not see them until after we land." "I appreciate your concern," Elijah replied with a slight smile that contained more meaning than she could yet understand. Near the front of the cabin, Michael Taylor was engaged in an increasingly uncomfortable conversation with a visibly frustrated passenger demanding information about the delay. "Sir, I understand your frustration," Michael said, maintaining professional composure despite his discomfort. "I can only tell you that we're waiting for final verification before departure." "Verification of what?" the passenger pressed. "We've been sitting here for over half an hour." Michael hesitated, caught between company protocols about public information and his growing ethical concerns about the situation. His response would require navigating conflicting professional obligations without clear guidance. Before he could answer, the aircraft door reopened unusual after it had been closed for departure. A woman in a Horizon Airways executive uniform stepped aboard, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Her purposeful stride and alert eyes suggested this wasn't a routine visit, but a deliberate intervention. "That's Vanessa Diaz," Sophia whispered to Rodriguez. "Regional VP of Operations." Rodriguez nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. Someone at headquarters must have noticed the delay pattern. Wilson emerged from the cockpit, his expression transitioning from irritation to confusion at the executive's unexpected arrival. "Ms. Diaz, we're in pre-departure." "Captain Wilson," she interrupted crisply.
I need to speak with you immediately. Without waiting for response, she turned to Rodriguez. First officer, please continue departure preparations.
The intervention created a new pivot point, a clear indication that standard protocols had been superseded by higher authority. Passengers watched with renewed interest, sensing that the unusual delay was approaching resolution, though the nature of that resolution remained unclear. In seat 3A, Elijah monitored these developments with thoughtful attention. The arrival of a regional VP suggested his text message had triggered Horizon's executive response system, a protocol he had personally designed for situations requiring rapid intervention. The system was working as intended, which was gratifying, but the public nature of the intervention meant consequences would extend beyond the immediate situation. The cabin fell unusually quiet as Wilson and Diaz moved to the galley area for a conversation conducted in low, intense tones. Though their words weren't audible to passengers, Wilson's increasingly defensive posture and Diaz's firm, contained gestures told a clear story of accountability being applied. After a brief but clearly consequential exchange, Diaz approached the cabin intercom while Wilson remained in the galley. His expression a complex mixture of confusion and dawning realization that something significant had shifted.
Ladies and gentlemen, Diaz began, her voice calm and authoritative. I apologize for the delay in your departure. We're making a slight adjustment to your flight crew and should have you on your way shortly. Thank you for your patience. This announcement, notable for what it didn't explain as much as what it did, created a ripple of whispered speculation throughout the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances and theories, recognizing that adjustment to your flight crew likely meant significant changes were occurring. Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit and conferred briefly with Diaz, their professional exchange suggesting contingency plans being activated. She then approached Sophia and they engaged in rapid, focused conversation about revised departure procedures. The operational machinery of Horizon Airways was clearly adapting to an unusual situation with practiced efficiency, suggesting that while this specific scenario might be unique, the company had systems in place to handle unexpected disruptions. Throughout this activity, Elijah remained seated, still maintaining his anonymous passenger role despite the temptation to directly intervene. His decision to let company systems respond without his visible involvement represented a test of the culture he had built, whether Horizon would uphold its values without the founder's direct oversight. As the cabin crew prepared for imminent departure under revised procedures, the atmosphere teetered between resolution and further complication. Everyone aboard Flight 1127 sensed they were witnessing something significant, a moment when standard aviation hierarchies encountered their limitations, and when unexamined assumptions faced direct challenge. What no one yet realized was that the most consequential revelation still awaited a truth that would transform not just this flight, but potentially the airline itself. Would you have spoken up in this situation? It's easy to say we'd all be heroes when discrimination happens in front of us, but when careers, schedules, and social pressure are on the line, the choice gets complicated fast. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know what you would have done if you were on this flight. Would you have recorded like Laura intervened directly, or kept quiet to avoid conflict? This moment reminds us that every day people face these difficult choices in workplaces, public spaces, and yes, even luxury airline cabins. The systems we build are only as good as the courage of the people within them. Have you ever discovered someone you underestimated actually held more power than you imagined? Those moments when assumptions get flipped and the person being dismissed turns out to be the boss, the owner, or the decision maker. Share your story in the comments. If you're finding this story thought-provoking, now's the perfect time to hit that subscribe button. We share these real-life accounts of justice, dignity, and unexpected consequences because they help us all reflect on how we treat others when status isn't immediately obvious. In the next few minutes, everything Captain Wilson thought he knew is about to be turned upside down. The revelation coming will change not just this flight, but potentially the entire airline's future. Stay with me as we see how this intense situation resolves.
As tension filled the cabin of Flight 127, the true identity of the passenger in seat 3A was about to be revealed. "Captain Wilson, I believe we need to finish our earlier conversation." Elijah's voice cut through the cabin's murmurs with quiet authority as he rose from seat 3A. The statement wasn't loud, but something in its calm certainty commanded attention, drawing every eye in first class. He stood with relaxed confidence, his posture neither aggressive nor apologetic, simply present and fully aligned with his purpose. Wilson turned from his tense conversation with Diaz, confusion momentarily overriding his defensive posture. "Sir, we're handling an operational matter. Please return to your seat." The edge in his voice couldn't disguise his growing uncertainty. "This operational matter concerns me directly," Elijah replied, stepping into the aisle. His next words fell like thunderclaps in the silent cabin, particularly since it appears to involve questions about my right to sit in first class on my own airline. The words landed with physical force. For 10 excruciating seconds, absolute silence gripped the cabin. No coughs, no shuffling, not even breathing seemed to disturb the perfect stillness that followed his statement. Then came the sounds of realization rippling through the space, sharp intakes of breath, a muffled, "Oh my God," the distinct click of Laura's phone as she continued recording. Wilson's face transformed in stages, confusion, giving way to disbelief, then to dawning horror as connections formed rapidly in his mind. The passenger's calm confidence, the regional VP's unexpected arrival, the way ground staff and other crew had reacted to his security concerns. Blood drained visibly from his face until he stood pale and rigid like a man watching his career collapse in real time. Wilson began voice cracking before he could finish the thought. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Elijah Montgomery," he confirmed with a slight nod, "founder and CEO of Horizon Airways." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Rodriguez's eyes widened momentarily before her professionalism reasserted itself. Sophia pressed her lips together, suppressing a complicated reaction. Michael froze mid-motion while serving a drink, nearly spilling it before catching himself. Among the passengers, the impact varied dramatically. Laura Thompson's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching vindication. Dr. Winters nodded, as though a hypothesis had been confirmed. The businessman who had defended Wilson's actions stared fixedly at the floor, suddenly intensely interested in the carpet pattern. "I typically fly anonymously to experience our service as our passengers do." Elijah continued, his voice level and conversational, despite the crackling tension. "It's how I ensure we're delivering on our promise that everyone receives the same respectful experience regardless of appearance or assumptions." He moved toward Wilson with unhurried steps, maintaining eye contact. "Today's flight has been instructive." Wilson seemed physically smaller somehow, his captain's uniform no longer projecting the same authority it had 30 minutes earlier. Sweat beaded visibly on his forehead as he struggled to process the catastrophic turn of events. "Mr. Montgomery, I was simply following security protocols," he stammered, voice barely audible. "No, Captain." Elijah interrupted, his tone soft but cutting. "You weren't." The simple contradiction, delivered without anger but with absolute certainty, hung in the air between them like a verdict. "You made assumptions based on how I looked," Elijah continued, each word precise and measured. "You questioned my right to occupy space you didn't think I belonged in. When documentation confirmed my seat assignment, you searched for explanations that would validate your initial judgment rather than reconsidering that judgment itself." He glanced around the cabin, acknowledging the collective witness of passengers and crew. "This isn't about embarrassing you, Captain Wilson. It's about honest recognition of what occurred here." Wilson's professional training finally reasserted itself. He straightened, gathering the remnants of his dignity. "Sir Mr. Montgomery, I apologize if my actions were misinterpreted. I assure you, I would have made the same security inquiries regardless of who. That's not true, and we both know it. Elijah said, his tone still calm, but now carrying an unmistakable note of finality. The integrity of Horizon depends on honesty, especially in difficult moments. Vanessa Diaz stepped forward. Captain Wilson, as previously stated, you're being removed from this flight. A replacement captain is already en route to take command. Her words, though professionally delivered, landed like nails in a coffin. Wilson looked from Diaz to Elijah, the full magnitude of his situation becoming unavoidably clear. His next words emerged quietly, almost to himself. You're actually the owner. Yes, Elijah replied simply. Then he delivered the line that would echo throughout the company for years to come. But more importantly, I was a passenger on your flight who deserved the same respect as anyone else. That shouldn't have required ownership to be secured. The profound silence that followed this exchange carried weight beyond words. It was the sound of realization of consequences arriving, of assumptions being irrevocably challenged, of a power dynamic completely inverted. Rodriguez broke the silence with professional focus. Miss Diaz, what's our updated departure timeline with the crew change? The relief captain will arrive within 10 minutes, Diaz replied, her tone shifting to operational efficiency. Anticipated departure 20 minutes after his arrival, assuming standard pre-flight checks. This exchange of normal aviation procedure amid extraordinary circumstances created cognitive dissonance. The ordinary and exceptional collided as regular flight operations continued around the unfolding human drama. Elijah turned to address the cabin at large. Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for the delay in your journey today. Every passenger on Horizon deserves on-time performance and respectful service. As a gesture of goodwill, everyone on this flight will receive credit for future travel, and our cabin crew will provide complimentary meal service regardless of cabin class once we're airborne. This brief announcement, acknowledging the disruption, taking responsibility without detailing its cause and offering concrete compensation, demonstrated the leadership style that had built Horizon's reputation. Wilson remained standing near the galley, his presence increasingly awkward as operational discussions continued around him. Diaz turned to him with professional courtesy that contained no warmth. Captain, please collect your personal items from the flight deck. Ground staff will escort you to operations for debriefing. As Wilson moved toward the cockpit, his pathway took him directly past Elijah. For a moment, the two men stood face to face, the pilot who had questioned a passenger's belonging and the airline owner whose anonymity had revealed uncomfortable truths about his company. This isn't just about today, is it? Wilson asked quietly, a hint of realization in his voice. No, Elijah replied with simple honesty. It's about creating an airline where moments like this don't happen to anyone whether they own the company or not. No further words were exchanged as Wilson continued to the cockpit. His movements mechanical, his 25-year career visibly reshaping itself around him with each step. As he disappeared into the flight deck, the cabin remained unusually silent, witnesses to a moment that transcended ordinary travel disruption. Something fundamental had been challenged, inverted, and possibly transformed in the confines of this aluminum tube still parked at gate B-17. What had begun as an expression of bias had evolved into a public reckoning with consequences that would extend far beyond Flight 1127. The revelation had occurred, but its true impact was still unfolding. The 30 minutes following Elijah's revelation unfolded with the controlled urgency characteristic of aviation operations adjusting to unexpected circumstances. Procedures designed for crew changes due to medical emergencies were adapted to this unprecedented situation with professional efficiency. Wilson emerged from the cockpit carrying his small pilot's bag, his face ashen, eyes fixed straight ahead to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. His shoulders, once squared with authority, now slumped slightly under the weight of public disgrace.
Two ground staff members waited at the aircraft door, their presence making the formality of the situation unmistakable. "Captain," Rodriguez said as he passed a simple acknowledgement that managed to convey respect for his professional position while not condoning his actions. Wilson paused briefly, a muscle working in his jaw. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, nodding once before continuing toward the exit without further interaction. His departure was witnessed in collective silence, the absence of dramatic confrontation somehow making the moment more rather than less significant. As the aircraft door closed behind Wilson, a subtle shift occurred throughout the cabin. Tension didn't dissipate entirely, but it transformed into something different, a shared awareness of having witnessed something consequential. Elijah returned to his seat without fanfare, declining the sudden deference crew members showed toward him with gentle redirections. "Please continue normal operations. I'm still just a passenger on this flight." This simple statement that even the airline's owner expected to be treated as a regular passenger reinforced the core message of the entire incident more effectively than any corporate policy could have. Vanessa Diaz moved through the cabin with focused efficiency, briefly conferring with Sophia about revised service plans before addressing passenger concerns about connections and arrival times. Her presence provided continuity of authority during the unusual transition. "The replacement captain will be Captain James Alvarez," she informed Rodriguez. "He's already been briefed and is reviewing flight plans now." Rodriguez nodded, visible relief washing over her features despite her professional composure. "I've worked with Captain Alvarez before. He's excellent." In the main cabin, flight attendants provided water service and connection information to passengers, their practiced hospitality, creating a sense of returning normalcy. Michael approached Elijah with evident nervousness, hands slightly shaking as he offered a fresh orange juice. "Mr. Montgomery, would you like anything while we wait for departure?" His voice cracked slightly on Montgomery, betraying his anxiety at addressing the airline's founder. Elijah smiled genuine warmth, replacing the measured control he'd maintained during the confrontation. "Just water is fine, Michael, and please call me Elijah." "Yes, sir, I mean Elijah." Michael's flustered response drew a gentle laugh from nearby passengers, breaking the tension further. Laura Thompson leaned across the aisle, her expression a mixture of awe and vindication. I don't even have words for what that was." "Necessary," Elijah replied simply. "Uncomfortable but necessary." Their brief exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Captain James Alvarez, a seasoned pilot in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and the confident movements of someone comfortable in crisis management. His entrance brought an immediate sense of restored order as he nodded professionally to the cabin before proceeding directly to the cockpit. Rodriguez met him at the cockpit door, their brief handshake and familiar greeting suggesting previous positive working experience. Their immediate focus on operational matters, weather patterns, fuel calculations, revised flight plans provided reassuring evidence that despite the unusual circumstances, aviation professionalism remained intact. Throughout the cabin, passengers processed what they had witnessed through their own perspectives. Some shared whispered conversations about discrimination and accountability. Others speculated about Wilson's future with the airline. A few snapped discreet photos of Elijah, the anonymous founder now unavoidably public. Dr. Winters approached Elijah's seat with purposeful dignity. "Mr. Montgomery, I've studied organizational responses to bias for 30 years. What I just witnessed was exceptional, addressing the issue directly without public humiliation, maintaining operational focus while not minimizing the ethical concerns. May I ask if this approach is codified in your company policies?" "It's more foundational than policy," Elijah replied thoughtfully. "We built Horizon around the principle that respect isn't a luxury amenity, it's the baseline for every interaction." Diaz approached with a tablet displaying updated departure information. "We're cleared for pushback in 7 minutes, Mr. Montgomery. Captain Alvarez has completed his checks and reports all systems normal." Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for responding so quickly to the situation. She nodded, professional but with evident pride. The Horizon Intervention Protocol worked exactly as designed. The Operations Center flagged the unusual delay pattern and identified your passenger record simultaneously. Response time was 19 minutes from alert to my arrival. This brief operational exchange revealed something significant about Elijah's leadership. He had built systems that functioned effectively even when he wasn't personally directing them. The company's values had been institutionalized beyond his individual presence. As departure preparations resumed, Sophia made a cabin announcement with renewed confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize again for the delay. We're now preparing for immediate departure with Captain Alvarez in command, assisted by First Officer Rodriguez. Our estimated arrival in San Francisco is now scheduled for 2:45 p.m. local time. We'll do everything possible to help those with connections. The familiar rituals of imminent departure, final cabin checks, seat back adjustments, closing overhead bins, created a reassuring return to routine after the extraordinary interruption. In the cockpit, Alvarez and Rodriguez completed final preparations with focused professionalism. Unusual first day flying together, Alvarez commented as they reviewed takeoff calculations. Unprecedented, Rodriguez agreed. Then, after a brief hesitation, thank you for responding so quickly. Some situations transcend normal scheduling, he replied simply, his focus already shifting to their imminent departure. As the aircraft finally pushed back from gate B-17 54 minutes behind schedule, the mood throughout the cabin had transformed. What had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation about belonging had evolved into something approaching its opposite, a shared experience that paradoxically created connection among those who had witnessed it. Flight 11127 was finally airborne, but the repercussions of what had occurred on the ground were only beginning to unfold. While Flight 1127 climbed to cruising altitude, the digital footprint of what had transpired was already spreading at the speed of modern connectivity. Laura Thompson's video, uploaded to social media during the crew change, accumulated views at an exponential rate, its impact amplified by her succinct caption, "Watched airline pilot question black passenger in first class. Plot twist, passenger owns the entire airline." Flying while black. Horizon Justice. By the time beverage service began at 10,000 feet, the video had been viewed over 150,000 times. Media outlets were contacting Horizon's communications department for confirmation and statements. Aviation forums buzzed with industry professionals dissecting the professional and ethical implications of Wilson's actions and Elijah's response. Across social media platforms, hashtags emerged organically, #flying while black, #Horizon Justice, #Who owns the seat. Some users shared their own experiences of being questioned or challenged in spaces where they didn't look like they belonged. Others debated whether Wilson's actions reflected reasonable security protocols or unjustified bias. Dr. Winters, the sociology professor who had spoken with Elijah, posted a thoughtful thread analyzing the incident from an organizational psychology perspective, highlighting how Horizon's response demonstrated values-based crisis management rather than mere damage control. Her analysis was reshared by several business publications, adding a layer of professional interpretation to the viral moment. Aboard the aircraft, passengers remained largely unaware of their flight's growing fame. Midway through the journey, however, phones connected to the onboard Wi-Fi began pinging with messages from friends and family who had seen the video. "Are you on the Horizon flight with the owner?" Read a text received by a passenger in economy. "They're saying the pilot got fired mid-flight. CNN is covering it." Similar messages created ripples of realization throughout the aircraft as passengers discovered their delayed flight had become a national conversation. Some began recording their own perspective videos, providing context or additional details from their vantage points.
Others sought out passengers who had been seated near Elijah during the initial confrontation, creating informal interview sessions in the aisles. In row 12, two social media influencers who had been upgraded due to a first-class passenger's medical emergency collaborated on content about the experience, careful to maintain respectful distance while capitalizing on their proximity to a viral moment. "We're literally on the flight that's breaking the internet right now," one whispered into her phone camera. At Horizon's headquarters, the communications team had activated their crisis management protocol, though several team members noted that this situation defied standard categories. "It's simultaneously a PR challenge and a powerful brand moment," the chief communications officer observed during their emergency meeting. "This could damage us or define us depending on how we respond." Their initial statement, released while Flight 1127 was still airborne, struck a careful balance. Horizon Airways confirms an incident occurred today involving a misunderstanding between a pilot and our founder, Elijah Montgomery, who was traveling as a regular passenger. The situation was resolved before departure with a crew change to ensure on-time performance. Horizon is conducting a thorough review consistent with our core value that every passenger deserves equal respect regardless of appearance or background. We will provide updates as appropriate. This measured response, neither denying the incident nor overreacting to it, reflected Elijah's own approach to the confrontation. It acknowledged the reality without sensationalizing it, focused on values rather than personalities, and emphasized process over punishment. Media requests flooded in from major networks and publications, many seeking exclusive interviews with Elijah upon landing. Aviation industry analysts began speculating about potential policy implications, with some suggesting the incident might trigger industry-wide reconsideration of how airlines addressed potential bias in safety and security protocols. Social media reactions split along predictable lines, with some users portraying Wilson as unfairly vilified for doing his job, and others celebrating Elijah as a hero for confronting discrimination with dignity rather than drama. The nuance of the actual interaction, its measured tone and focus on principles rather than personalities, was frequently lost in these polarized interpretations. What distinguished this incident from similar viral moments was the unusually high percentage of aviation professionals engaging in the conversation. Pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and other airline personnel shared perspectives that transcended the usual binary debates discussing the complex interplay between authority, safety, service, and potential bias in their daily work. A group text chain among Horizon pilots reflected this complexity. "Could have been any of us in Wilson's position," wrote one. "Disagree," responded another. "I've never questioned a first-class passenger's right to be there based on appearance. The issue isn't the question, it's the persistence after documentation was verified," added a third. These industry conversations, though less visible than the public social media storm, potentially held more significant long-term implications for how airlines approached these issues. As Flight 1127 passed the midpoint of its journey to San Francisco, Elijah remained in seat 3A, responding to occasional emails, but mostly observing the now exceptional service being provided throughout the aircraft. He had declined Sophia's offer to make an announcement addressing the situation, preferring to maintain as much normalcy as possible for the remainder of the flight. "The incident speaks for itself," he told her quietly. "Adding commentary now would just create more disruption for passengers." This decision, prioritizing passenger experience over personal narrative control, reflected the same leadership philosophy that had guided his response to Wilson: focus on systems and outcomes rather than individual drama or vindication. By the time Flight 1127 began its descent into San Francisco, the incident had transcended mere viral moment to become something approaching a case study in real-time corporate values application. What had occurred in the confined space of an aircraft cabin was now being discussed in business schools, newsrooms, and corporate boardrooms across the country. The flight that had begun with one man questioning another's right to occupy space had evolved into a national conversation about who belongs where, who decides, and how organizations respond when those decisions reveal uncomfortable truths. As Flight 1127 crossed the Nevada desert at 36,000 feet, the characters involved in the morning's confrontation found themselves navigating internal transformations as profound as their physical journey westward. The revelation of Elijah's identity had catalyzed personal reckonings throughout the aircraft. Elijah himself experienced perhaps the most nuanced shift. His quarterly anonymous flights had always been professional exercises, controlled experiments in service quality. Today's flight had unexpectedly transformed from professional assessment to personal experience, forcing him to navigate not just as a CEO evaluating his company, but as a man confronting bias directed at him personally. As he stared out the window at the landscape below, his calm expression masked a complex internal struggle. For a moment during the confrontation, he'd felt the familiar flash of anger, the same burning indignation he'd experienced countless times throughout his life when judged by appearance rather than substance. The temptation to respond with cold fury, to use his power to utterly destroy Wilson's career with a single word, had been viscerally real. Yet he'd chosen a different path, not from weakness, but from the hard-earned wisdom that retribution, however satisfying in the moment, rarely creates lasting change. The incident had reminded him of his mother's words when he'd faced discrimination in college. Your response defines you more than their actions define them. When Sophia stopped to check on him, he asked a question that revealed his internal processing. Do you think I should have identified myself sooner? The question showed something significant. Despite his external composure, he was genuinely reflecting on his own decisions, not just Wilson's actions. I don't think timing would have changed the fundamental issue, Sophia replied thoughtfully. Captain Wilson made assumptions he shouldn't have made regardless of who you were. Elijah nodded, considering this. But would earlier identification have spared other passengers the delay? That's the balance I'm struggling with, addressing the principle versus minimizing collateral impact. This reflection, questioning his own choices even after being vindicated, revealed why Elijah had succeeded where other wealthy founders had failed. His concern remained focused on system impacts rather than personal vindication. In the cockpit, First Officer Rodriguez experienced her own transformation, though in her case it manifested through professional actions rather than visible reflection. Her handling of flight communications demonstrated new confidence, clear, decisive language, without the hesitation that occasionally characterized junior officers. The morning's events had accelerated her evolution from competent first officer to emerging leader. When Captain Alvarez noticed this shift, he acknowledged it directly during a quiet moment at cruising altitude. You've got exceptional command presence today. Necessity, she replied simply, though the slight straightening of her shoulders betrayed her appreciation of the recognition. Sometimes necessity reveals what was already there, Alvarez observed before returning to his flight calculations. This brief exchange captured Rodriguez's transformation, not a fundamental change in character, but an acceleration of potential already present. Standing firm during the confrontation had required moral courage, and that exercise of courage had strengthened rather than depleted her. For Sophia, Martinez's transformation manifested through subtle shifts in how she managed her cabin team. Throughout the flight, she demonstrated increased willingness to delegate significant responsibilities to Michael and other junior crew members, trusting their judgment rather than micromanaging their interactions with passengers. This adjustment reflected her processing of the morning's events, recognizing that Horizon's values were reinforced not through rigid hierarchy, but through distributed responsibility and trust. When Michael successfully handled a complicated situation involving a passenger's medical needs, Sophia acknowledged his work with simple appreciation rather than correction or guidance. Well done, she said, the brief praise carrying more impact than elaborate recognition would have. Michael's transformation was perhaps the most visible among the crew. The uncertain probationary flight attendant who had frozen during the initial confrontation had evolved into someone navigating complex passenger dynamics with newfound confidence. During meal service, when a passenger made a dismissive comment about all the fuss over seating, Michael responded with poised professionalism. "Horizon believes every passenger deserves the same respectful service, sir. It's not about the seat, it's about the principle." This response, clear values aligned and delivered without apologetic tone, demonstrated how thoroughly he had internalized the morning's lesson. His transformation wasn't about technical skills, but about finding his voice as a representative of the company's values. Laura Thompson, whose recording had helped document the incident, experienced her own subtle shift. Initially motivated by indignation at witnessing discrimination, her perspective evolved as she observed Elijah's measured response. When another passenger asked why she hadn't posted her video with more inflammatory commentary, her response revealed this evolution. "The facts speak for themselves. Adding emotional language would actually diminish the impact." This approach, letting reality speak rather than shaping it through commentary, reflected a move from reactive documentation toward more thoughtful witness. The experience had refined her understanding of effective advocacy. Perhaps the most profound transformation occurred among passengers who had initially supported Wilson's actions. The businessman who had defended the captain's security concerns approached Elijah during the flight's second hour, visibly uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Montgomery," he began awkwardly, a slight sheen of sweat on his forehead, betraying his discomfort. "I want to apologize for some comments I made earlier. I assumed the captain must have had valid reasons, but it's clear now that wasn't the case." "Thank you," Elijah replied simply, neither dismissing the apology nor exaggerating its significance. "I work in financial services," the man continued, adjusting his tie nervously. "And I'm wondering if we have similar blind spots in how we assess clients." This moment, a passenger moving from defending bias to questioning his own industry practices represented the deeper transformation potential of the incident. Individual reckonings rippling outward into broader professional reflection. Throughout the aircraft, similar recalibrations occurred as passengers and crew processed what they had witnessed. The confrontation had forced everyone aboard to examine their own assumptions about authority, belonging, and appropriate response to perceived difference. Even those not directly involved found themselves reassessing. A retired teacher in economy class composed a message to her grandchildren about what she had observed, writing, "I've always taught you to speak up when you see injustice, but today I learned something about how to speak up with dignity, rather than anger, with clarity, rather than accusation." As Flight 1127 began its initial descent into San Francisco, these individual transformations collectively created something larger, an aircraft full of people who had shared not just a journey through physical space, but through a moral landscape where abstract values had been made concrete through specific choices and consequences. What had begun as a confrontation between two individuals had evolved into a catalyst for personal reflection that would continue long after landing. The true power of the incident lay not in its viral potential, but in these quieter, deeper transformations occurring in hundreds of individual consciences. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into San Francisco International Airport. Local time is 2:37 p.m. with clear skies and temperature of 68 degrees. Flight attendants prepare the cabin for arrival. Captain Alvarez's announcement marked the approach of Flight 127's journey to its physical conclusion, while the human dynamics set in motion hours earlier continued to evolve. The immediate conflict that had delayed departure had been resolved through Elijah's revelation and Wilson's removal, but the process of addressing its implications was ongoing. In the first-class cabin, service completion took on an almost ceremonial quality. Flight attendants who had witnessed the morning's confrontation now served the airline's owner with a careful balance of respect and normalcy following his earlier request to be treated as a regular passenger while inevitably bringing extra attention to detail. Sophia conducted a final cabin check with particular thoroughness, pausing briefly beside Elijah's seat. "We'll be on the ground shortly, Mr. Montgomery.
Ground staff has been advised of your arrival, but no special arrangements have been made as per your preference. Thank you, Sophia, he replied, his gaze meeting hers directly. You've handled an extremely unusual situation with exceptional professionalism today. This brief exchange, observed by nearby passengers, demonstrated the resolution approach that had characterized Elijah's handling of the entire incident, acknowledging reality without ceremony, focusing on performance rather than position, maintaining perspective about what truly mattered. In the cockpit, Rodriguez and Alvarez completed landing preparations with focused efficiency. Their professional partnership, formed under unusual circumstances, had developed into effective collaboration that transcended the morning's disruption. Horizon Operations is requesting an incident summary after landing, Rodriguez noted as she reviewed final communications. Standard procedure, Alvarez replied, his hands moving confidently across the controls. Just document the facts without editorial comment. The situation speaks for itself. This approach, factual documentation without unnecessary elaboration, aligned with how Elijah had handled the confrontation itself. The consistency between leadership philosophy and operational practice reflected an organizational culture where values manifested in practical actions rather than remaining abstract principles. Throughout the aircraft, passengers prepared for landing with the usual rhythms of arrival, collecting personal items, powering down larger electronics, discarding unwanted items. These ordinary actions carried additional significance after the extraordinary events that had preceded them, a return to normalcy that felt earned rather than assumed. Laura Thompson, who had documented the original confrontation, chose not to record these final moments of the flight. Her decision reflected a developing understanding that some experiences were more valuable as personal witness than public content, that not everything meaningful required digital sharing to matter. As the aircraft made its final approach, Elijah gazed out the window at the distinctive geography of the San Francisco Bay, his expression thoughtful but composed. The city represented significant history for Horizon Airways, its first headquarters location before expansion had necessitated larger facilities in Dallas. The approaching conclusion of this flight was bringing him full circle in multiple ways. Flight 127 touched down smoothly at 2:41 p.m., 4 minutes ahead of the revised arrival estimate. Captain Alvarez's landing announcement carried the simple satisfaction of professional standards maintained despite unusual circumstances. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. Local time is 2:41 p.m. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate and the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign. On behalf of First Officer Rodriguez and our entire crew, thank you for flying Horizon Airways. The aircraft taxied toward Terminal 2, where ground staff awaited with the usual arrival preparations, jet bridge positioning, baggage handling, coordination, connection information updates. What distinguished this arrival from ordinary operations was the presence of several Horizon executives on the jet bridge, their formal attire and alert postures suggesting this was not routine gate management. As the aircraft reached its final position and the engines spooled down to silence, Elijah remained seated while other passengers prepared for disembarkation. This small courtesy, allowing others to proceed first, despite his position, reflected the same principles that had guided the airline's founding status, shouldn't determine service quality or basic consideration. When he finally rose to collect his carry-on, several nearby passengers nodded acknowledgement or offered brief words of support. These interactions weren't fawning or excessive, just simple human recognition of something meaningful witnessed together. "Thank you for handling that with such dignity," Dr. Winters told him quietly as she retrieved her bag from the overhead bin. "It would have been easy to make it about power rather than principle. The principle matters more than the position." Elijah replied, the statement simple but foundational to his leadership philosophy. As passengers departed, crew members maintained professional composure while clearly recognizing the flight's significance. Michael, collecting final service items near the galley, spoke briefly with Sophia. "I've never experienced anything like today," He said, his tone suggesting the comment encompassed both the confrontation's difficulty and its educational value. "Aviation careers are long," she replied with the wisdom of experience. "The real measure is what we learn from exceptional situations." When Elijah finally moved toward the exit, the remaining passengers and crew fell into a natural moment of quiet, not orchestrated respect, but spontaneous acknowledgement of the morning's significance. He paused at the cockpit door, exchanging brief words of appreciation with Alvarez and Rodriguez for their professional handling of an unprecedented situation. As he stepped from the aircraft into the jet bridge, the waiting Horizon executives greeted him with subdued professionalism rather than excessive ceremony. Their presence acknowledged the situation's significance without creating additional spectacle, exactly the balance Elijah had established throughout the incident. The intervention protocol performed as designed. The Chief Operations Officer reported concisely. "Communications has prepared options for your review regarding public response. Let's discuss after I've had a chance to speak with legal about Captain Wilson's status," Elijah replied, already focusing on next steps rather than dwelling on what had occurred. This forward orientation, addressing consequences while maintaining focus on improvement rather than punishment, characterized the resolution approach Elijah had demonstrated throughout. The immediate conflict had been resolved not through dramatic confrontation, but through principled action and appropriate accountability. As Elijah walked with his executive team toward the terminal, Flight 1127's resolution phase transitioned into its aftermath, the longer process of addressing structural implications rather than just individual actions. The immediate conflict had concluded, but its ripple effects were only beginning to spread throughout Horizon Airways and potentially the broader aviation industry. In his private office overlooking Dallas at sunset, Elijah Montgomery stood before a wall of photographs documenting Horizon Airways' 9-year journey from concept to industry leader. The golden light bathed the images in warmth, highlighting moments of triumph, challenge, and transformation that had shaped both the airline and its founder. His gaze settled on a particular image, his parents standing proudly beside him at the acquisition of the company's first aircraft, their expressions reflecting both joy and concern about their son's audacious venture. Eleanor and William Montgomery had worked their entire lives as educators, instilling in him values that later became Horizon's foundation. His father, a high school principal who believed character education mattered as much as academic achievement, and his mother, a community college professor who taught her students that dignity transcended circumstance, had shaped his understanding of leadership long before he built an airline. "They worried I was risking too much financially," Elijah reflected with a slight smile, remembering their cautious support of his aviation ambitions. "But they worried more that success might change what I believed about people and their fundamental worth." Their concern that achievement might erode rather than reinforce values had guided his approach to building Horizon. From the beginning, he had insisted that respectful treatment wasn't a premium amenity, but a baseline expectation regardless of ticket class or passenger appearance. Flight 1127 had tested that commitment in unexpected ways, revealing both strengths and gaps in its implementation. A gentle knock interrupted his reflection. Amanda Reyes, a recently promoted flight attendant who had joined Horizon's leadership development program, stood in the doorway, with evident nervousness, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Mr. Montgomery, I was told you wanted to meet before my first Foundations training assignment." "Amanda, please come in," Elijah replied warmly, gesturing toward comfortable chairs arranged for conversation rather than status demarcation. "And yes, I try to connect personally with everyone who joins the training team. It's too important to delegate entirely." As they settled into conversation, Amanda's initial nervousness gradually transformed into genuine engagement. She had joined Horizon specifically because of its reputation for values-aligned leadership drawn to an organization where principles apparently transcended publicity statements. "I've been studying the Flight 1127 case as part of my preparation," she said, leaning forward with evident curiosity. Everyone talks about it, but I'm curious, what do you think was the most important outcome from that day? The question was refreshingly direct, reflecting the conversational openness that had developed throughout the organization following the incident. Elijah considered it thoughtfully, his response measured rather than rehearsed. "Not what most would expect," he replied finally, his eyes reflecting the depth of his consideration. The most important outcome wasn't the policy changes or the training improvements, though those mattered. It was the collective recognition that our values aren't abstract concepts, but practical choices that require constant vigilance, especially when they conflict with conventional assumptions. Amanda nodded, processing this perspective. "That makes sense. I've noticed how the senior team talks about principles as operational matters rather than just ethical statements." "Exactly," Elijah affirmed, leaning forward slightly. "Flight 1127 taught us that values only matter when they influence decisions under pressure, when adhering to them carries consequences, positive or negative." Their conversation continued, touching on Amanda's background, her aspirations within Horizon, and her questions about effectively facilitating values-based learning. Throughout the exchange, Elijah demonstrated the same leadership qualities that had guided his response to Flight 1127: thoughtful attention, genuine curiosity about others' perspectives, and focus on principles rather than position. As their meeting concluded, Amanda posed one final question that caught him slightly off guard. "Do you ever regret not identifying yourself earlier during that flight? It might have prevented the delay for other passengers." The question reflected the kind of thoughtful consideration Horizon now cultivated throughout its organization, balancing multiple considerations rather than seeking simple answers. Elijah's response was equally thoughtful, his expression revealing the genuine self-reflection the question prompted. "I've asked myself that many times." He acknowledged, his voice quieter. "But I've concluded that the delay, while unfortunate for those passengers, created space for something more significant: the opportunity to see how our systems and people responded to bias without the founder's direct intervention. That knowledge proved invaluable for meaningful improvement." After Amanda departed, Elijah returned to the window, watching Horizon aircraft taking off and landing at the nearby airport, physical manifestations of the vision that had evolved from concept to reality over 9 challenging years. Each plane represented not just transportation, but transformation, the commitment to create an airline where respectful treatment wasn't contingent on appearance, class, or circumstance. His attention was drawn to a particular moment unfolding on the tarmac below. A Horizon ground crew had surrounded an elderly passenger who appeared disoriented after deplaning. Instead of rushing her to clear the walkway, they formed a protective circle. One agent kneeling to speak with her at eye level, another retrieving water. All of them pausing their busy schedules to address her needs with unhurried attention. It was a small moment, the kind that would never make headlines or social media, but it embodied exactly what Horizon was built to be: an organization where human dignity remained primary regardless of operational pressures. As twilight deepened over Dallas, Elijah reflected on the journey still unfolding. The work of alignment between values and action was never complete. It required constant attention, honest assessment, and willingness to address gaps when identified. Flight 1127 hadn't resolved that challenge, but had strengthened the organization's capacity to engage with it authentically. Tomorrow he would board another anonymous flight, continuing the practice that had unexpectedly revealed so much about his airline's strengths and opportunities. The experience would provide fresh insights about current operations, identifying both progress and continuing gaps between aspiration and implementation. This ongoing commitment, persistent attention rather than declared victory, represented Elijah's fundamental approach to values-based leadership.
Flight 1127 had ultimately taught him that principles matter most not in moments of public declaration, but in daily choices that rarely make headlines but collectively define an organization's true character. As darkness fell over the city, the lights of aircraft moving through the night sky created patterns of connection, physical manifestations of the human relationships that gave air travel its deeper purpose. Beyond transportation, beyond profit, beyond operational metrics, these connections represented Horizon's ultimate mission, bringing people together with dignity intact, regardless of who they were or how they appeared. That mission continued flight by flight, choice by choice, day by day, the ongoing journey of an airline committed to proving that values and value could not just coexist but reinforce each other. Flight 1127 had become not just a challenging moment to overcome, but a catalyst that continued strengthening that commitment long after the immediate situation had resolved. True leadership isn't about titles or authority. It's revealed in how we respond when our values are tested under pressure. The story of Flight 1127 reminds us that meaningful change rarely comes from grand declarations, but from consistent choices that align principles with practice, especially when that alignment carries consequences. What would you have done in that first-class cabin? Would you have spoken up like Laura, stood firm like Elijah, or found another way to address what was happening? These moments of decision reveal our character more clearly than any statement of values ever could. Each of us faces similar choices daily, though usually less dramatically. When we witness someone being treated differently based on appearance, do we intervene or remain silent? When our own assumptions about who belongs where are challenged, do we defend those assumptions or examine them honestly? When organizational practices conflict with stated principles, do we accept the contradiction or work toward alignment? These questions matter not just ethically, but practically. Organizations where values and operations align perform better than those where they conflict. Relationships built on consistent respect prove more durable than those dependent on fluctuating circumstances. Individual well-being improves when our actions match our principles rather than contradicting them. Flight 1127's most powerful lesson isn't about dramatic confrontation, but about quiet commitment. The consistent choice to uphold dignity, even when that choice isn't convenient or conventional. Elijah's response wasn't remarkable for its authority, but for its authenticity, maintaining principle without performative outrage, addressing reality without excessive reaction. That balanced approach, principled but practical, firm but fair, offers guidance for navigating our own challenging moments, whether in workplaces, relationships, or communities. It reminds us that true respect isn't a luxury amenity, but a fundamental necessity for meaningful connection and sustainable success. As you reflect on this story, consider where in your life values and actions might need greater alignment. What principles do you claim to uphold that might benefit from more consistent implementation? What systems or practices in your organization create gaps between stated values and operational reality? What daily choices reinforce or undermine the dignity of those around you? These questions rarely have simple answers, but engaging with them honestly creates possibility for growth, individual and collective evolution toward greater integrity between what we say matters and what our actions demonstrate actually matters to us. Perhaps the most powerful truth Flight 1127 reveals is that transformation doesn't require exceptional circumstances, but exceptional commitment, the willingness to examine assumptions, adjust practices, and accept consequences when principles and convenience conflict. That commitment, multiplied across individuals and organizations, creates meaningful change far beyond what policies or proclamations alone can achieve. If this story has impacted you, please hit that like button right now to help more people see it. This kind of content only reaches those who need it when viewers like you take action. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful, true stories that will transform how you think about dignity, respect, and leadership in everyday life. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our newest uploads. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. A friend, colleague, or family member who might be inspired by Elijah's calm strength and principled leadership. Remember, respect isn't determined by the seat we occupy, but by the choices we make when those seats are challenged. And sometimes, the most powerful response to being underestimated isn't dramatic revelation, but quiet, principled persistence in occupying the space we rightfully claim. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep standing in your truth with both dignity and grace.